On the night of June 19th, 1921, the Savoy Hotel was filled with representatives from every walk of life. From a Scottish sheep farmer all the way to some of the most important political dignitaries from across the Commonwealth. These stories are now able to be told in a much more comprehensive and detailed way, thanks to the work of Mary and her team. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to explore your family story and how that story intertwines with others. It's a chance to find the parallels between our lives and our ancestors' lives. It gives us the ability to see just how devastating the First World War was, the pandemic of the Spanish flu, and the recession and economic situation that was occurring across the country. The stories of the Savoy Hotel are numerous. It was quite difficult, actually, to pick who I was going to talk about today. And the names in front of you may appear to be a very randomly collected sampling, but they all, in fact, have at least one thing in common: this very building that we sit in now. The first person found on the census in the Savoy is a Charles Smith, a journalist. He was born in Hamilton, Canada, but was working for the Argus, Australia in 1921. I actually wish I could kind of go back in time and talk to Mr. Smith and just sit in the lobby with him and swap stories. Imagine the people watching you could do in the Savoy lobby in 1921. Time travel hasn't been invented yet, so instead of Mr. Smith, I'll share all of those stories with you. So I hope you won't mind being my Mr. Smith today. I'm going to start where Mary left off, actually, with Kathleen Melda Bergen. Mary told you that Kathleen was cashier here at the Savoy, but alongside her in that boarding house, unsurprisingly for the area, are several actors and actresses. One of her co-residents in this building is Florence Allen, a married actress from Essex. She resided there with her husband, Edward, who was a motor engineer. While Florence was out of work on the night of the census, she noted that she was employed regularly by the Gaiety Theatre in the London West End. Her association with the Gaiety was in place for some years, and she's seen here from one of our newspaper clippings in the role of Aladdin. Fabulous costume, right? The Gaiety Theatre was under the control of theatre manager Edward Loriard, who used the Savoy as his residence. In January of 1921, he and his partner, George Grossmith, hosted their annual dinner with over 300 guests in the ballroom, just right up the stairs, including celebrities, actors and actresses, and theater employees from all levels of the business and industry. While the Gaiety was lost to us after the Blitz, it had a major influence on the development of modern musical comedy as we know it today. Loriard also influenced another iconic location you may be familiar with, the Piccadilly Theatre, which was built for his production company in 1928. We know, of course, that celebrities have walked these halls for many, many years, and certainly we couldn't talk about the theater industry and the theater business without talking about the Savoy and the Savoy Theatre itself. And that leads us to our next character in this cast, Nicholas James Mockett, head porter and longtime employee of Mr. Gilardi, the general manager. He is thought to be the first employee of the Savoy, in fact, but he was a longtime household servant before the hotel opened. Employment as a household servant, as many of us know, generally took over your entire life. So for the 30 years prior to this, in all the previous censuses, James and his wife would be recorded in different locations. James was always found at his place of employment as a live-in servant, and his wife in their personal home. The 1921 census is the first time they are found together on the same page. Now, James has a particular story that I really enjoyed. In December of 1921, just a few months after the census is taken, Princess Mary attends a fundraising event at the Savoy Theatre. This was essentially a talent show, a competition matinee of servicemen in which the audience applause determines the winner. Sounds kind of familiar, right? Many of us have seen these types of programs on television. But in 1921, it was a new idea, and it was a relatively novel one. They weren't really sure that this was going to be a successful event. All of the acts were amateurs, and all were survivors of the Great War. One of the men that performed was blind, another one without a leg. Princess Mary was a patron of the sponsoring veterans organization that hosted the event, and while it was novel, It was a huge success. On that day, when she entered the hotel, Nicholas presented a bouquet to her on behalf of the entire Savoy staff. A week later, a royal household messenger in livery arrives in the lobby, and while the staff tried to urgently push him into the general manager's office, he insists on staying in the lobby. He finds our porter, Nicholas, and he presents a gift back from Princess Mary, a photograph, a portrait of him making that bouquet presentation a week before. Nicholas states to the reporters that have gathered that he will buy the most expensive frame in all of London to put it in, and he put it on his hearth. Princess Mary is just one of the many celebrities that we will find in the pages of and history of the Savoy, and of course, Census Night was no exception. When many of us think of the Savoy, we actually think of glitz and glamour. I certainly did when I heard we were going to be here today. And this is the case, of course, on Census Night. And we find Charlotte Josephine Collins, better known as Josie Collins, and her husband, Lord Robert Edward Innes Kerr, in residence. Charlotte was a childhood star and had several notable roles during her career on stage and screen. Her nickname was the Maid of the Mountains, thanks to a musical from the same name that she performed in 1917. She was actually married 3 times. Robert was her second husband, so we know that divorce reform law worked out okay. This celebrity wedding made the headlines. Celebrity weddings tend to do that. But this one was a particularly bit of juicy gossip, as they'd actually been married for several days before that was announced. Lord Robert was a very notable Scotsman, of course. Second child in his family line. Duke of Roxburgh was his father. He served in the Great War in the Royal Air Force. He was injured during that experience, and he eventually relinquished his commission and served through the rest of the war in a citizen role. Certainly wasn't the only Scotsman here that night. Notably, this is one of my favorites, I'm just gonna be honest. Well, Robert came from the elite class, right, and would have been considered well-known. This man deserves a moment of our time. When I first saw him on the census, I will admit I was completely surprised. What is a simple Scottish farmer doing at the Savoy? I couldn't imagine 2 more opposite sides of the spectrum. I had to know his story, and I'm very glad I took the time, because while the census gives me all the clues I needed to find his story, the way he represents himself is just a very small part of that. This is 55-year-old Robert Clark Patterson, who was better known as the King of Patagonia. He and his brothers had built a sheep empire in Argentina. In the 1921 census, he simply says sheep farmer, but his story is clearly far more complex than that. Argentina had become a home for Scottish sheep farmers. This was a booming business. So while Robert Clark Patterson treated himself and presented himself in a very humble way, his reputation as a businessman far preceded him. In 1922, they sent finally a delegation from the British government to Argentina to see what all of this was about. And in that visit, Robert Clark Patterson was actually nominated by a neighbor and accepted the role of vice consul. It was his first foray into politics. He was no stranger to politics and the business world, and he was certainly no stranger to taking care of himself, although he was quite humble. We find him on passenger lists moving back and forth between the UK and Argentina a number of times, in which he pretty much always travels first class. So the man knows how to take care of himself. He's staying at the Savoy, he's moving in first class. It's not bad. In today's terms, he would have been considered a millionaire, perhaps even a billionaire. I noted that he started a venture in politics. He didn't spend a lot of time there, but he did understand the importance of that relationship between private entity and the government. And so he represented as best he could. Now, I don't know about you, maybe it's my American background and American life, but politicians don't typically represent themselves as humble, in my experience. Thank you for that, American politicians. So this story has a number of twists and turns. We certainly couldn't address this period of time in the Great Britain without talking about politics, though. And that leads me to the Imperial Conference. The country is in turmoil. There's a housing crisis, a recession, a population recovering from the most disastrous war in its history, and that little thing called a global pandemic. The morning of June 20th was an important one across the country and certainly here in London. It wasn't just the day after the census, which we all know is the most important day of the year, right? Most important day of the decade is when that census is taken. It was actually also the first day of the 1921 Imperial Conference. If the census had not been delayed, as Mary talked us through, we would have missed this opportunity to see political dignitaries, their staff, and in some cases their entire families scattered across the city. In fact, the entire fourth floor of this grand hotel was taken over by the Australian Prime Minister and his party, including Mr. Percy Dean, who was somewhat famous in his own right here in London and enjoyed that notoriety while he was in residence here in the country. The Imperial Conference was chaired by British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and the largest issue on the agenda that year was the Anglo-Japanese alliance. But there were numerous issues, of course, both domestically and internationally, that needed to be addressed. It was the first time India had been invited to the conference and had a seat at the table. And it was the first such conference since the conclusion of the war. The world was watching, and the Commonwealth was very much in the spotlight. South African Prime Minister Jan Smuts was known around the world for his leadership and efforts throughout the war and the peace conference in Paris in 1919. And while he did stay in the hotel for the duration of the conference, on census night, he was actually socializing, visiting longtime friends Arthur and Margaret Gillet. At the conclusion of the conference, he wrote a letter sent from his room here at the Savoy, advising Eamon de Valera to leave Ulster alone and to concentrate on a free constitution for the remaining 26 countries of Ireland. De Valera would declare himself president of the Republic in August, and of course we know that the Irish question would continue to be debated for a number of years. Civil war started in 1922. So while that letter may not have made the impact that the Prime Minister had hoped for, it certainly hit newspapers. In fact, it was copied into almost every newspaper in publication across the country at that time. And how do we know that? How did it get into so many newspapers? Well, where there are politicians and where there are celebrities, there is always press. This conference was global news, and so we see Philip L. Jackson, a newspaperman from Oregon, and Carl Axel Helmarky, a newspaper editor from Stockholm, here at the Savoy. It is likely they were all here to cover the conference. There was one other writer here, though, that night that was certainly not here to cover the conference. He was, in fact, on the run. William Baynard Hale was an American journalist from Indiana. He rose quickly in his career. He was editor of the Cosmopolitan magazine, the New York World, managing editor of Philadelphia's Public Ledger, even spent a few years on the staff at the New York Times. In 1908, he interviewed Emperor Wilhelm II of Germany. He sold that interview, but it was ultimately squashed by the German government. They kept it hidden, and it was not published. Just before the war broke out across Europe, he served as a special agent to President Woodrow Wilson in Mexico. And Wilson, of course, was a leader of the progressive movement, and certainly would be the one to lead America into the war as well. William Baynard Hale, however, knew that his political leanings were changing. And in fact, over the course of his lifetime, he swung to the extreme opposite end of that political spectrum, going from a trusted advisor to President Wilson all the way to the far opposite side. In fact, he's seen here in the photograph sitting on the summer house of President Wilson's summer house. William Baynard Hale eventually aligns himself with the German government, and he starts to speak out against America and her allies, particularly during the war. Publications like this one lead him to actually being ostracized from his home in the United States. He leaves, leaving his wife and 2 children behind, and he travels to Germany, where he spends the rest of his life in exile. He eventually starts to write literature as a propagandist for Germany. He dies there a few years after the conclusion of the war. That article, that interview with the Kaiser back in 1908, was finally published in 1917 and spread alarms across the Allied countries because in that interview, 9 years prior, the Kaiser had predicted a world war. We can see from the collection of reporters, newspapermen, and writers, the census is not limited to just the permanent population of England and Wales. This census is more than just a view of the population of this country. It captured, in a very unique way, everyone who was here that night, and that includes many people of international birth and citizenship. You might expect that more guests were here of international birth than not. It is a hotel, after all. But this is just one example of the type of research that we all now get to participate in, which is very exciting. This is a period of unprecedented international travel. Going from country to country is simply easier than it ever has been. And we can see that across the pages of the census. So let me introduce you to one last person, Harry Craddock, who took advantage of this uptick in international travel. Born in Gloucestershire, he and his wife, Annie, immigrated to America in 1897. They lived in Chicago, Ohio, and New York, and even became naturalized citizens of their new home. By 1917, he was working as a bartender at the Holland House in New York City, right in Manhattan. He certainly made a name for himself there, mixing cocktails and concoctions that no one had yet dreamed up. And then, disaster hits. Well, disaster if you're a bartender anyway. The people of the United States choose prohibition, and mixing a cocktail becomes illegal. Many in the profession head to Europe, and so too did Harry and his wife, Annie. They obtained US passports to travel to England for 6 months to visit family, and they just simply never went back. Harry begins his career at the Savoy in the second half of 1920 and is included in a number of newspaper articles, including this one from the Tatler, which gives us one of my favorite lines I think I've ever seen in a newspaper, that he will be turning us from the path of strict sobriety. He is named the king of cocktail makers and is known to show off the last receipt of the last legal cocktail mixed in the United States. All you had to do was go to the bar and ask him. Craddock was named head bartender in 1925, and he enjoys extreme popularity throughout London, with his latest and greatest hitting the newspapers across the country and mixologists everywhere, globally, attempting to duplicate his work. In 1930, the Savoy publishes the very first recipe book for cocktails, with Harry's name right on the front cover. And by the way, if you want to buy an original copy on eBay, it's around £1,000. I checked. Today, family historians have the opportunity to see history through a very unique lens. We live and research in an extremely exciting time. Our discoveries allow us to see patterns and intricacies of life that bring seemingly random characters together, just as we've done today for those people at the Savoy. And it strikes me that we're all here, learning together, having this day and this event. And while on the surface, you may not think that we have very much in common, but I can guarantee at least two things. The first thing we have in common is that each of us is very passionate about history and exploring our ancestors' lives. And the second thing that we now have in common, the Savoy Hotel.